The winter of 1881 brought more than snow to Redemption Flats. It brought a man with a leather satchel full of gold certificates and a question that would tear the town apart from the inside. By the time anyone understood what he truly wanted, 3 families had already taken his money, the bank had closed its foreclosure list, and Margaret Holloway was standing in her dead husband's boots, wondering if mercy could sometimes be the cruelest thing a person offers. If you enjoy real Western stories, subscribe and stay with this one. Margaret Holloway woke that November morning to frost on the inside of her bedroom window. She dressed in the dark, pulling on 2 layers beneath her work dress, then walked downstairs to find her youngest daughter already stoking the kitchen stove. The girl was 9 years old and had learned not to waste matches. Their ranch sat 4 miles north of Redemption Flats, on land that had once supported 200 head of cattle. Now Margaret counted 63, and each week she sold another pair just to buy flour and lamp oil. Her husband Thomas had died in the spring from a horse that spooked at nothing, his neck broken before he hit the ground. The bank held a note for $800, due in full by January. The cattle she had left might bring $300 if she could find a buyer before the snow made the drive impossible. She poured coffee from yesterday's grounds and watched her daughter arrange kindling. The girl's hands moved with the careful precision of someone who understood that waste meant cold, and cold meant choosing which room of the house to abandon first. In town, Samuel Chun stood behind the counter of his dry goods store and counted the coins in his register. $12.30. On the wall behind him hung a list of families who bought on credit names written in his own hand, amounts that had grown from pennies to dollars over 18 months of drought and failed crops. He owed his supplier in Cheyenne $460. The supplier had stopped shipping 3 weeks ago. Samuel was 41 years old. He had come to Wyoming Territory in 1868, worked on the railroad until his hands couldn't hold a hammer anymore, then saved enough to open this store in a town that had seemed, back then, like it might grow into something. Now the railroad had rerouted south, the silver mine had closed, and the families that remained were the ones too poor to leave or too stubborn to admit defeat. He looked at the list of names. Families he had known for years. Children he had watched grow tall enough to see over his counter. He could forgive the debts, write them off, and lose the store by Christmas. Or he could press for payment and watch those same families lose their land. Either way, someone would go under. The mathematics of it sat in his chest like a stone. Down the street, John Porter was shoeing a horse that didn't need it. The animal belonged to him, and the work was just something to do with his hands while he thought about the letter in his coat pocket. The bank had sent it yesterday. His forge, his tools, his small piece of land, all of it mortgaged for $200 3 years ago, when his wife got sick and the doctor's bills piled up faster than he could work. She had died anyway. Now the bank wanted their money, and John had $63 saved in a tin buried beneath his anvil. He set down the rasp and straightened his back. He was 52, and his shoulders hurt every morning now, the kind of hurt that didn't fade with movement. He had been the only blacksmith in Redemption Flats for 14 years. Before that he had worked in Pennsylvania, before that in Ohio, always moving west with the idea that space and opportunity were the same thing. Now he was out of west to move to. The town itself sat in a shallow valley between hills that turned gold in summer and gray in winter. 214 people lived within 5 miles of the main street. They had a church, a schoolhouse that doubled as a meeting hall, Samuel's store, John's forge, a boarding house, and a bank managed by a man named Horace Leland, who had come from St. Louis and still wore a city suit even when the dust turned everything the same color. The bank was the newest building in town, constructed with real milled lumber and glass windows. Horace Leland kept a ledger that listed every outstanding loan in the county, and he slept well at night because he believed the numbers were neutral, just facts written in ink, owing nothing to sentiment or circumstance. That afternoon, the stranger arrived at a roan gelding that looked like it had come a long way without hurrying. He rode down the main street at a walk, his hat pulled low, his coat dusty but well made. He stopped in front of the bank, dismounted, and tied his horse to the rail with the practiced efficiency of a man who had done it 10,000 times. Margaret Holloway saw him from the window of Samuel's store, where she was counting out coins for a sack of cornmeal. She noticed the horse first, a good animal, well fed and cared for, and then the man himself. He moved like someone comfortable in his own skin, neither hurried nor slow. He carried a leather satchel under one arm. Samuel noticed him too. Most strangers passed through Redemption Flats without stopping, and the ones who did stop usually needed directions or a meal. This man walked into the bank and stayed there for 20 minutes. When he came out, Horace Leland followed him onto the street. The banker's face was flushed, and he was talking quickly, gesturing with his hands. The stranger listened without responding, then nodded once and walked toward the boarding house. Horace Leland stood on the boardwalk and watched him go, then turned and went back inside. By evening, the whole town knew something had happened, but nobody knew what. The stranger took a room at the boarding house and paid for a week in advance with a $20 gold piece. Mrs. Alma Garrett, who ran the place, made change from a jar she kept hidden in the kitchen and tried to make conversation, but the man offered only the basics. His name was William Kane. He had business in the area. No, he didn't need meals included. That night, Margaret's daughter asked if they could light a fire in the front room, just for an hour. Margaret said no. They sat together in the kitchen instead, close to the stove, and Margaret mended a tear in her work dress while her daughter practiced her letters on a slate. The girl wrote the alphabet forwards and backwards, then started on simple words. When she wrote father, she paused, her chalk hovering over the slate, then erased it and wrote winter instead. Margaret watched her daughter's face in the lamplight and felt the particular loneliness of being the only thing standing between a child and the cold. She thought about the cattle, about the banknote, about the fact that her husband's boots still sat by the door, because she couldn't bring herself to sell them even though someone might pay $1 for good leather. The next morning, William Kane walked to Samuel Chun's store and stood at the counter until Samuel looked up from his account books. Kane said he understood Samuel was owed money by various families in town. He asked to see the list. Samuel hesitated. The list was private business, the kind of thing a man kept to himself out of respect for his neighbors. But something in Kane's manner, calm, direct, patient, made him pull the ledger from beneath the counter and turn it so the stranger could read. Kane studied the names and amounts without comment. Then he reached into his satchel and withdrew a stack of banknotes held together with a paper band. He counted out $460 and set it on the counter. Samuel stared at the money. Kane said the debts were paid, all of them. Samuel could tell his customers their accounts were settled. Samuel found his voice and asked why. Kane said he would explain that later. For now, the money was Samuel's and the families owed nothing. Then he walked out. Samuel stood alone in his store, looking at more cash than he had seen in 2 years, and felt something shift in his chest that was neither relief nor gratitude, but a kind of vertigo, as though the ground had suddenly tilted and he wasn't sure which way was down. By noon, the story had spread. Kane had done the same at the bank. He had walked into Horace Leland's office, reviewed the foreclosure list, and paid every outstanding loan in full. 8 families totaling just over $3,000. He had counted out the money in clean banknotes and gold certificates, signed the receipts, and left without explaining himself. Margaret heard about it from a neighbor who rode out to her ranch that afternoon. At first she didn't believe it. Then she rode into town herself and found Horace Leland in his office, pale and confused, holding a stack of settlement papers that proved the story was true. Her debt was gone. The ranch was hers, free and clear. She asked Horace who the man was and what he wanted. Horace said he didn't know. Kane had asked questions about the families, how long they had lived in the area, whether they were honest people, if they were likely to stay or move on. But he hadn't explained why he was paying their debts, and Horace hadn't thought to refuse the money. Margaret walked out of the bank and stood in the street, looking at the boarding house where a lamp burned in an upstairs window. She felt like she had been handed her life back, but the hand that gave it was still closed around something she couldn't see. 3 days passed. William Kane spent his time walking through town, observing. He watched John Porter work the forge. He sat in the back of the church during Sunday service. He ate breakfast at the boarding house and made polite conversation with Mrs. Garrett about the weather and the condition of the roads. People began to relax. The initial suspicion faded into cautious acceptance. A man had done them a kindness. Perhaps he was wealthy and eccentric. Perhaps he had his own reasons that didn't concern them. Either way, their debts were paid and winter was coming, and they had enough to worry about without inventing problems. Then, on the 4th day, Kane called a meeting. He asked Mrs. Garrett to spread the word. He wanted to speak with everyone he had helped, all the families whose debts he had settled. 7 o'clock that evening, at the schoolhouse. Margaret arrived early and found the room already filling. She recognized every face. John Porter sat near the back, his big hands folded in his lap. Samuel Chun stood by the window, looking uncomfortable in a room full of people he usually served from behind a counter. The others were ranchers, a widow who ran a laundry, a young couple who had homesteaded a section of scrubland east of town. Kane stood at the front of the room and waited until everyone settled. Then he spoke. He said he had paid their debts because he believed they were good people who had been pressed by circumstances beyond their control. He said he didn't expect repayment. The money was a gift. A murmur went through the room. Relief, gratitude, confusion. Then Kane said there was one condition. The room went quiet. He needed a name, just one. Someone who had lived in or near Redemption Flats at some point in the past 20 years. He didn't say why he needed it. He didn't say what he would do with the information. He only said that in exchange for clearing their debts totaling nearly $4,000, he wanted them to give him one name. Someone asked what kind of name he was looking for. Kane said he would know it when he heard it. He asked them to think carefully. He would wait. Then he walked out of the schoolhouse and left them sitting there in the lamplight, looking at each other across the sudden distance his request had created. Margaret rode home in the dark, her mind working over the problem like a knot she couldn't untie. A name, that was all. But the way Kane had said it, calm, patient, certain, suggested the name mattered more than the money. She thought about people who had passed through town over the years. Drifters, workers, families who had tried and failed and moved on. She thought about the man who had sold Thomas the cattle that first year, and the surveyor who had mapped the county, and the traveling preacher who had come through every spring until the congregations got too small to make the journey worthwhile. None of them seemed important enough to be worth $4,000. In town, Samuel Chun sat in his darkened store and went through his own list of names. He had kept records since the day he opened, every transaction, every customer. Hundreds of names over the years, most of them ordinary people living ordinary lives. A few who had caused trouble. A few who had left debts unpaid. But nothing that would explain why a stranger would arrive with a fortune and ask for a single name in return. John Porter lay awake in his small house behind the forge and stared at the ceiling. He had been in Redemption Flats longer than most. He had known people who were dead now, people whose names had faded from memory. He tried to think if any of them had been remarkable enough to matter to someone like Kane. Nothing came. The next day, people started talking to each other. Quiet conversations at first, then more open speculation. Someone suggested Kane was a bounty hunter looking for a fugitive. Someone else thought he might be a lawyer settling an estate. A third person wondered if he was building a case against someone, a witness to a crime, maybe, or a debtor who had skipped out on a larger obligation. The theories multiplied, but none of them fit the facts. Kane didn't act like a hunter or a lawyer. He acted like a man waiting for something specific, content to let time do the work. Margaret began to notice changes in the town, small things. People who had been friendly now watched each other with caution. Conversation stopped when someone approached. Families who had shared meals and labor for years suddenly kept to themselves. The debt had been a shared burden. Now the weight of the stranger's question was shared too, but in a way that divided rather than united. She went to see Samuel one afternoon and found him sorting through old receipts, his face drawn with exhaustion. He looked up when she entered and managed a tired smile. She asked if he had thought of a name. He said he had thought of dozens. None of them felt right. She asked what he thought Cain really wanted. Samuel set down the papers and rubbed his eyes. He said he didn't know, but the not knowing was worse than the debt had been. At least with debt, you understood the terms. You knew what you owed and to whom. This was different. This was a bargain with invisible edges. Margaret left the store feeling more unsettled than when she had arrived. That evening, a man named Peter Ruskin came to her ranch. He was one of the families. Cain had helped a homesteader with 3 children and a wife who had never fully recovered from the last birth. He stood in Margaret's kitchen, turning his hat in his hands, and said he thought he might have a name. Margaret waited. Peter said there had been a man years ago who worked on a ranch west of town. He had been there only a season, maybe less. Peter couldn't remember his full name, something like Garrett or Carrot. The man had left suddenly, and there had been talk. Nothing definite. Just a sense that something had happened. Margaret asked what kind of something. Peter shook his head. He didn't know. It was old gossip, half remembered. But it was the only unusual thing he could think of, and he was tired of searching his memory every night while his children slept and his wife coughed in the next room. He asked if Margaret thought he should tell Cain. Margaret looked at this man standing in her kitchen, this neighbor she had known for 5 years, and saw the exhaustion in his face. She saw what the question was doing to all of them, how it was turning their relief into anxiety, their gratitude into suspicion. She said she didn't know what he should do. But she thought Cain would wait as long as it took, and the waiting might break them before the truth ever surfaced. Peter left without deciding. 2 days later, another meeting was called. This time it was organized by the townspeople themselves, without Cain's involvement. They gathered at the church after dark, and someone suggested they simply refuse to give a name. They had accepted the money in good faith. Cain's condition had come afterward. Perhaps they could return the money, or perhaps they could simply tell him they had no name to give. Horace Leland pointed out that the debts were legally settled. The money had been paid, the papers signed. There was no mechanism to reverse the transactions. Someone else said they could just make up a name, send Cain on his way. Samuel Chun stood and said that whoever they named, true or false, would carry that mark for the rest of their life. If they lied and Cain discovered it, what then? And if they told the truth and gave him someone's name, someone who might be innocent, someone who had simply lived here and moved on, what responsibility did they bear for whatever came next? The room fell silent. Margaret realized that the stranger's question had revealed something about her neighbors she had never seen before. People she had trusted were now capable of considering betrayal. People she had thought strong were showing fear. The fabric of the community was pulling apart, thread by thread, and Cain hadn't even pressured them. He had simply asked and waited. A week after the meeting at the schoolhouse, William Cain knocked on Margaret's door. She invited him in because refusing would have been more suspicious than hospitality. He sat at her kitchen table, declined coffee, and said he wanted to talk. He asked how she was managing the ranch alone. She said she was managing. He asked about her daughter. Margaret felt a cold spike of fear. She kept her voice steady and said her daughter was well. She asked why he wanted to know. Cain said he liked to understand the people he helped. He had chosen Redemption Flats carefully. He had studied the town, the families, the debts. He believed they were worth helping. But he also believed that kindness without honesty was hollow. Margaret asked what he meant. Cain said the name he was looking for belonged to someone who had done harm. Not casual harm, not the small cruelties of ordinary life, but real damage that had never been accounted for. He said the people of Redemption Flats knew who it was. whether they realized it or not. The name existed in their collective memory, buried under years and distance, but still there. He said he would wait as long as necessary. Then he thanked her for her time and left. Margaret sat alone at her table and felt the walls of her house press inward. She thought about harm and memory and the things people chose to forget, because forgetting was easier than acting. That night she couldn't sleep. She lit a lamp and walked through the house, looking at the objects Thomas had left behind: his coat on the hook, his rifle above the door, his books on the shelf, a Bible, a guide to livestock diseases, a novel he had read so many times the spine was broken in 3 places. She opened the novel and saw his handwriting on the inside cover. A date from 1876 and a name, Thomas Holloway, purchased in Cheyenne. Below that, in different ink, another note, borrowed to J. Carrick, returned September 1877. She stared at the name, J. Carrick. The memory came back slowly. A man who had worked on their ranch the first year they were married. Young, maybe 25. Quiet. He had stayed through the summer and into the fall, then left without much explanation. Thomas had paid him fairly, and the man had done good work. Margaret had barely thought about him since. But now that the name was in front of her, other details returned. The way Carrick had avoided town. The way he had kept to himself even when other workers tried to include him. And something Thomas had mentioned once, casually, about Carrick having trouble somewhere back east. Nothing specific, just a sense that the man was running from something. Margaret closed the book and set it back on the shelf. She didn't know if Carrick was the name Cain wanted, but it was a name and it came with a shadow, and she had no way of knowing what giving it to Cain would mean. The next morning, she rode into town and found Samuel Chun. She told him about Carrick. Samuel listened, then went to his own records. He found a receipt from September 1877. Carrick had bought supplies: flour, coffee, ammunition. He had paid in cash and signed the receipt with initials only. Samuel looked at Margaret and said he remembered the man now, vaguely. He had seemed nervous, like he expected trouble. They went to see John Porter. The blacksmith had shod Carrick's horse twice. He remembered because the horse had a bad hoof, and Carrick had been particular about the work, checking it himself before he paid. Slowly, a picture formed. J. Carrick had been in Redemption Flats for 4 months in 1877. He had worked, stayed quiet, and left. Nobody knew where he had come from or where he had gone, and nobody had thought about him in nearly 5 years. Margaret asked if they should tell Cain. John Porter set down his hammer and said that depended on whether they thought Carrick had done the harm Cain was talking about. None of them knew. Samuel said maybe they should find out more before they gave the name. Maybe they should ask around, see if anyone remembered anything specific. But Margaret shook her head. She said asking questions would spread faster than answers. The whole town would know they had a name, and then the pressure would shift to whether they gave it or protected it. Either way, the division would deepen. She said maybe the better question was why Cain had chosen this method. If he knew who he was looking for, why not just say the name? Why make them search their own memories, their own consciences? John Porter said maybe that was the point. Maybe Cain wanted them to choose. That afternoon, Peter Ruskin came to the forge and said he had decided to give Cain a name. He said the debt had been too much, and his family needed the relief, and if Cain wanted a name, then Cain would get one. He said he remembered a drifter from years ago who had stolen a horse. He would give that name and be done with it. John asked if the drifter had anything to do with Cain's question. Peter said he didn't care. He just wanted the stranger gone and his family safe. John said giving a false name would make things worse, not better. Peter said things were already worse. His wife couldn't sleep. His children asked questions he couldn't answer. The whole town was tearing itself apart over a question nobody understood. He would give Cain a name, any name, and let the man do whatever he came here to do. He left before John could argue further. That night, Margaret lay in bed and thought about the choices in front of her. She could stay silent and let someone else provide a name, true or false. It didn't matter. She could give Cain the name Carrick and hope that it was the right one, that whatever harm had been done deserved whatever Cain intended. Or she could confront Cain directly and demand to know what he really wanted before anyone gave him anything. None of the options felt right. She thought about Thomas, about the kind of man he had been. Careful with his words, slow to judge, but firm when he saw injustice. He would have walked straight to Cain and asked the hard questions. He wouldn't have waited for the town to tear itself apart. Margaret got out of bed, dressed, and rode into town in the dark. She found William Cain sitting on the porch of the boarding house, a lantern at his feet, a book open in his lap. He looked up when she approached, unsurprised, as though he had been expecting her. She tied her horse and climbed the steps. She didn't sit. She said she wanted the truth. Not hints, not patience, not philosophy. She wanted to know who he was looking for and why. Cain closed his book and set it aside. He was quiet for a long moment, and in that silence Margaret heard the wind moving through the empty street, the distant sound of a dog barking, the creak of the boarding house settling. Then Cain said he was looking for a man named James Carrick. Margaret felt her stomach drop. Cain said Carrick had worked for him once years ago on a ranch in Colorado. Cain had trusted him. He had given him responsibility, treated him fairly. And Carrick had repaid that trust by stealing $20,000 in bearer bonds from Cain's safe and disappearing. Cain had spent 5 years looking. He had tracked Carrick through 4 territories, always a step behind. He knew Carrick had passed through Redemption Flats in 1877. He knew Carrick had used the money to start over somewhere, under a new name, and that the people who had helped him, whether they knew it or not, were part of the chain that let him escape. Margaret said the people here didn't know anything about stolen bonds. They were just trying to survive. Cain said he believed that. That's why he had paid their debts. He didn't blame them for Carrick's crimes. But he needed the name because it was the last link in the chain. Someone here knew where Carrick had gone, or who he had talked to, or what he had said about his plans. That information was worth $4,000 to him. Margaret asked what he would do when he found Carrick. Cain said that was between him and Carrick. Margaret said that wasn't good enough. She said if the town gave him the name, they would be complicit in whatever came next. They had a right to know. Cain stood and looked at her directly. He said Carrick had stolen 5 years of his life. He had taken money that wasn't his and built a future on a foundation of theft. Justice didn't have an expiration date. Margaret said justice and revenge weren't the same thing. Cain said maybe not. But he would settle for either. Margaret left the boarding house with her hands shaking. She rode home through the dark, and when she arrived her daughter was awake, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp lit. The girl asked if everything was all right. Margaret said she didn't know. The next morning, she gathered Samuel, John, and 2 other families Cain had helped. She told them what Cain had said. She told them about Carrick, about the stolen bonds, about the 5 years of pursuit. John Porter asked if they believed Cain's story. Margaret said she did. The way he had told it, without embellishment, without asking for sympathy, it had the weight of truth. Samuel asked if they had any obligation to help a man pursue revenge. One of the farmers said revenge wasn't their concern. Cain had paid their debts freely. If he wanted a name in return, that was the bargain. But the farmer's wife shook her head. She said they hadn't known about the condition when they accepted the money. They had been manipulated into a position where saying no felt impossible. Margaret said maybe that was the real test. Maybe Cain didn't just want the name. Maybe he wanted to see what kind of people they were, whether they would trade a man's life for their own comfort. John said they didn't know what Cain would do to Carrick. Maybe he just wanted his money back. Maybe he wanted to see Carrick face trial. Samuel said or maybe he wanted to kill him. The room went quiet. Margaret said they had to decide, together, because if they gave Cain the name, they all carried the responsibility. And if they refused, they all carried the weight of that choice too. The town met that night at the church. Not just the families Cain had helped, but everyone. Word had spread, and people wanted a voice in what happened next. William Cain was invited, but did not attend. He stayed at the boarding house, reading, waiting. Margaret stood at the front of the church and explained the situation. She told them about Carrick, about the theft, about Cain's 5-year search. She told them that giving the name, participating in whatever Cain had planned. She told them that refusing might mean losing the security Cain's money had bought, though she didn't know if Cain would actually demand repayment. Then she opened the floor. Peter Ruskin spoke first. He said they owed Cain nothing beyond gratitude. The debts were legally settled. If Cain wanted the name badly enough, he could keep searching on his own. But Samuel Chun stood and said that wasn't the point. The point was whether they would help a man find justice, or whether they would protect a thief because it was easier than facing a hard choice. A woman in the back asked how they knew Carrick was guilty. They only had Cain's word. John Porter said that was true. But if Carrick was innocent, he had nothing to fear from Cain finding him. And if he was guilty, then maybe he deserved to face the consequences. Someone else said consequences delivered by a private citizen with a grudge weren't justice. They were violence dressed up in moral language. The arguments went back and forth. Some people wanted to give the name immediately. Others wanted to refuse on principle. A few suggested they tell Cain they would help him only if he promised not to harm Carrick. Margaret listened to all of it and realized they were circling the same question from different angles. Did they trust Cain? Did they trust themselves? And what did it mean to be a community if the first test of their unity was whether to betray a man who had lived among them, however briefly, however long ago? Finally, an older woman named Catherine Mills stood. She had lived in Redemption Flats since before it had a name. She had buried 2 husbands and raised 6 children. Her voice carried the kind of authority that came from surviving. She said they were asking the wrong question. The question wasn't whether to give Cain the name. The question was what kind of town they wanted to be. Did they want to be the kind of place where people looked out for each other, even when it was hard? Or did they want to be the kind of place where debts could be paid with betrayal? She said Carrick might have been a thief. He might deserve whatever Cain had in mind. But that wasn't for them to decide. Their job was to live with the choices they made. And she, for one, didn't want to spend the rest of her life wondering if the name they gave had ended in a grave somewhere. She sat down. The room was silent for a long time. Then Margaret said they would take a vote. Everyone present would have a say. They would decide together, and whatever the outcome, they would stand by it. The vote was close. 31 to 27. They would not give Cain the name. Margaret was chosen to deliver the decision. She walked to the boarding house alone, knocked on Cain's door, and told him. Cain listened without expression. Then he asked if she knew the name. Margaret hesitated. Then she said yes. Cain asked if she would give it to him privately, regardless of the vote. Margaret said no. Cain nodded slowly. He said he respected that. Then he asked one more question. Did she believe Carrick was guilty? Margaret said she didn't know. She had only met him once years ago, and he had seemed like a man running from something. But running didn't prove guilt, it just proved fear. Cain said fear and guilt often traveled together. Margaret said so did fear and innocence. Cain smiled faintly. He said she was right. He thanked her for her honesty and said he would leave in the morning. Margaret turned to go, then stopped. She asked what he would do now. Cain said he would keep looking. 5 years had already passed. A few more wouldn't matter. She asked if he would ever stop. Cain said probably not. Some things didn't heal with time. They just became part of who you were. Margaret left him there and walked home under a sky full of stars that seemed indifferent to the small struggles of the people below. William Cain left Redemption Flats the next morning, as promised. He paid Mrs. Garrett for his room, thanked her for her hospitality, and rode out on the same roan gelding he had arrived on. The town watched him go, and when he was out of sight, people began to exhale. But the relief was complicated. They had kept the name, but the keeping had cost them something. The easy trust they had shared before Cain's arrival was gone. They had learned that they were capable of considering betrayal. That desperation could make them weigh a stranger's life against their own security. Margaret went back to her ranch and worked through the winter. The debt was still gone. The land was still hers. But she thought about Cain often, and about Carrick, and about the strange mathematics of mercy. Samuel Chun reopened his ledger and saw the empty pages where debts had been. He felt grateful and guilty in equal measure. John Porter returned to his forge and found that the work didn't quiet his mind the way it used to. He kept thinking about the vote, about how close it had been, about the fact that if 4 people had chosen differently, they would have given Cain the name and lived with that instead. In the spring, a letter arrived for Margaret. It was from William Cain. He wrote that he had found James Carrick in Nevada, working under the name James Carr. He wrote that the law had been involved, that the bonds had been recovered, and that Carrick was now serving time in a territorial prison. He wrote that he had not killed him. He had wanted to, for a long time, but in the end he had chosen the law because Margaret's question had stayed with him. Justice and revenge aren't the same thing. He thanked her for that. Margaret folded the letter and put it in the box where she kept Thomas's things. Then she walked outside and looked at the land that was still hers. The cattle that had survived the winter, the daughter who was growing tall and strong. She thought about the stranger who had paid everyone's debt and the name they had refused to give. She thought about how close they had come to making a different choice and what that choice would have cost them. The town of Redemption Flats continued. Debts accumulated again, as they always did. Families struggled and helped each other. The church held services. The school taught children. Life moved forward in the way it does, one season following another, one choice leading to the next. But the people remembered. They remembered the winter. A stranger came with a satchel full of money and a question that had no easy answer. They remembered the vote and the fear, and the moment they had chosen to protect a name over accepting a gift without conditions. And in that remembering, they understood something about themselves they hadn't known before. They understood that a community wasn't just the people who lived in it. It was the choices they made together, especially when those choices were hard. Margaret taught her daughter this lesson without ever saying it directly. She taught her through the way she treated their neighbors, through the care she took with her word, through the example of standing firm when standing firm meant losing something valuable. Years later, when her daughter was grown and the story of the stranger had become something people told on winter nights, someone asked Margaret if she thought they had made the right choice. Margaret said she didn't know. Right and wrong weren't always clear, but they had made an honest choice, and they had made it together, and they had lived with the consequences without regret. That, she said, was what mattered. The story of William Cain and the name that was never given became part of Redemption Flats the way all important stories do, woven into the fabric of the place, shaping how people saw themselves and each other. It became a reminder that kindness without strings was rare, that debts could be paid in more than money, and that sometimes the hardest thing to do was to choose principle over comfort. Margaret Holloway lived on that ranch for another 30 years. She raised her daughter, saw her married, and welcomed grandchildren who played in the same fields where she had once counted cattle and worried about winter. The land prospered in some years and struggled in others, but it remained hers. Samuel Chun kept his store until he was too old to stand behind the counter, then passed it to a nephew who had come west looking for opportunity. The ledger with the erased debts stayed on the shelf, a reminder of the year everything almost fell apart. John Porter worked his forge until his hands couldn't hold a hammer anymore, then spent his last years sitting on his porch, watching the town change and grow. He never forgot the vote, or how close it had been, or the weight of making a choice that mattered. And somewhere in Nevada, a man named James Carrick served his sentence and thought about the choices that had brought him there. He thought about the ranch in Wyoming where he had hidden for a season. and the people who had known his name but never given it up, and the strange mercy of strangers who had protected him without knowing they were doing it. The bonds were returned. The debt was paid. Justice, in its cold and impersonal way, was served. But the story that mattered, the one that would be told and retold until the people who lived it were dust, was not about justice or revenge or stolen money. It was about a town that chose to be the kind of place where a man's life, even a thief's life, was worth more than their own comfort. It was about people who looked at a hard choice and made it together and lived with it together and became something better because of it. That was the real debt that was paid that winter. And that was the name they carried forward, not Carrick's name, but their own. The name of a community that had been tested and had chosen, however imperfectly, to be worthy of the land they lived on and the lives they built there. In the end, that was worth more than $4,000. It was worth everything.